Not last summer, but the summer before, I was on sabbatical. And as part of my sabbatical discipline, I started baking. And I got this book about baking, this book about artisan baking, this book by a guy who'd had a different job and then gave that up to become a baker. And so it had recipes, and it had information, it had theories, it had chemistry, it had kind of everything that you would need to start making good, nice, artisan bread. Mine turns out, after a year and a half, about 70% of the time. There are always little differences and little changes, and my oven isn't perfect, but we do our best. And we end up with bread. The book was called Flour, Water, Salt, Yeast. The 4 ingredients that you need to make good, solid, classical artisan bread. You need flour. Flour's kind of the basis of bread. You need some kind of flour, and there are lots of different kinds of flour, but you need flour. Usually not 3 measures of flour. That's a lot of flour. That is like 140 odd cups of flour. I have at home these flour containers, these nice closed things. I don't think they'll hold 144 cups of flour. I also have those big Cambro plastic dealies that you can put stuff in and store it or use it or mix it or whatever, and I'm not positive that they would hold 144 cups of flour. 144 cups of flour is a lot of flour. You need water, enough to get the flour wet and sticky and into kind of a mass so that it can start to form those nice chains of gluten and start expressing those nice starches and sugars so that it can become bread instead of a lump of flour with salt and yeast just sort of added on top. Strictly speaking, you don't need salt. You can get away without it, but it adds flavor, and there are other places where Jesus talks about being the salt of the world. And my understanding is that there's some biochemistry involved somewhere with the salts. But that is science, and I am not so much a science person. So I will leave it to the experts to say whether you should have salt. And this guy says you should. So flour and water and salt. Strictly speaking, you do not need yeast. Today, you don't need yeast because, well, we have chemical leavening agents like baking soda. Back in the day, you did not need yeast because there's yeast kind of everywhere. And if you want to do it, you can just lay out the flour and the water, and yeast will find its way in. But I usually use the instant yeast that you keep in the fridge and that you hope is still active and will work, even if it's been in there for a while. You also don't need yeast because you don't have to have the bread rise. You can leave it flat. You can end up with a cracker. And crackers are fine. Crackers are actually kind of important to the whole Jewish and the whole church thing. If you're Jewish and you're making matzah, you have to mix it fast enough that none of the yeast that is all around gets into it. That's the rule. If the yeast gets into it, if it starts to rise just a little, well, then it's not matzah. And then if you're trying to have it during Passover, you don't have any bread to eat. In the Christian faith, we have often used unleavened bread for communion. If you remember our little astronaut packs, they had a little bit in the top of unleavened bread that, if they were fresh, was crunchy, and if they had sat around for a while, was disgusting. So flour, water, salt, yeast. Flour, water for sure. Salt, please. Yeast if you want it. Yeast is important to me. Yeast is what makes the bread rise. Yeast is what makes the bread big. Yeast gets in there and it finds that starch and that sugar and it eats it up. It gobbles it up. It loves it so much and it gets too full. And it gets kind of bloated and then it burps. And it releases the gases that blow up the bread, that make those beautiful holes in a loaf of bread. Our parables today are about small things becoming big. The mustard seed that gets planted somewhere, and the yeast that gets put into a whole lot of flour. And it starts to do its work. That yeast eats up the sugars and gets full and gets bloated and lets out the gases. And 144 cups of flour. That was either a lot of loaves or one huge loaf. Yeast is important. This small thing that can do so much. Every so often an article will cross my feed. This week there was one about the decline of the church. We've talked about this before. Every generation from the boomers on, over time, becomes less engaged. They might start out going to church, usually because their parents made them. But as they age, they go a little less. And each successive generation starts out less engaged than the previous one. There's less belief, there's less belonging, there's less just being religious, whatever that means. And so every generation, the church is a little bit smaller. I worry about that. Admittedly, I worry about that for some personal reasons. I love the church. I love the United Church of Christ. I love working in the church. I love being a pastor. I love doing this stuff. And it would break my heart if someday it just went away. It would break my heart for me, and it would break my heart for the people who come after me. There are fewer people pursuing ministry as an option. There are fewer people heading off to seminary and spending the time and the money to go into a field where maybe you might possibly be able to find somewhere a part-time job. It is a lot of work to have a different job that actually pays the bills. But I am also worried about that for big cultural reasons. Churches are one of those places where we learn values. They're one of the few places that are expressly about values. They're one of the few places where somebody can stand up each week and say, for God's sake, people, love each other. Love your family and your friends and your neighbors. Love strangers and immigrants and folks you've never seen before in your life. Love your enemies. The world would be a better place if there were more love in it. There are so few places that we can go and hear that message. That message that we all know is true deep in our hearts, but that it is easy to forget in a world where so many forces say, only love your neighbors. Only love people who are like you. Only love people who are close to you. Forget about the strangers. Close the borders, build walls. Keep yourself safe from those evil, terrible, rotten people out there. Hate your enemies, and they are your enemies. Build the wall. It will keep you safe. It'll keep you safe from enemies. It will keep you safe from poverty, and it will give you something to do. Love money. Money, after all, can buy you walls. Money can do a lot of things. Money can make you secure. Love money. Go after the money. Love power. It feels good in the moment to have power over others, so love it with everything that you have. Love control. Love popularity. Love followers on TikTok and Instagram. There are a lot of forces in the world that tell us what to love, that make, frankly, a mockery of love, that take love and stretch it out and fold it and wrench it. And unlike dough, love is not that elastic. It doesn't just pop back into shape. It gets deformed and torn and ripped and then left on the floor to rot. I can look around the world and I can see that love has gotten messed up. I can see that we do not have enough of it. It takes about 5 minutes with a television and an internet feed and social media to see that the little bit of love we have left is messed up. And I worry. I worry because I don't know of enough places that are saying, for God's sake, people, love. The world would be a better place if we loved. But I have faith. I have trust. I have hope. I have the evidence of things unseen to say that there is still love in the world. I know that there is love here. I know that we are good at loving. We are good at loving each other. We are good at loving our family and our friends and our neighbors. We are good at loving strangers. We are okay at loving enemies. But we are practicing love. We are practicing Christians, and that means we do the best we can until we know how to do better, and then we do that, and we get better every day, I hope. That love is yeast. It is the kingdom of God. It is God's reign. It is love, and it is yeast, and it is working. We are taking in what we can of the world and putting out love that will fill it. Love that will make God's reign bigger. Love that will make God's reign so much bigger. And we are buried. I know we are buried. I know we are buried in 3 measures of flour. It's a lot. But little by little we do it. There are 2 other ingredients in bread. The book doesn't mention these, which is a little disappointing. I mean, it talks about them, but it doesn't name them as ingredients, but they are important ingredients. One is heat. The bread goes in the oven. The dough goes in the oven. And the heat helps those gases expand and browns the outside and creates that crust that breaks so nicely when you tear the bread. I'll talk about heat sometime, I'm sure, but the other ingredient, the important ingredient, the ingredient we need to acknowledge, the ingredient we need to know about is time. Baking is full of time. You take the flour and the water, you combine them together, and you wait. You wait for them to kind of get nice and intermixed with each other, to autolyze, to start forming those chains of starches and sugars and gluten that will be so delicious. And then you add the salt and the yeast, and you wait. You wait for the yeast to work, to eat up all of the stuff and to get full and bloated and to burp out its splendid gas. You put it in the oven and you wait. You wait for it to finish rising. You wait for it to brown. There is, with bread, so much waiting. And you can make the waiting longer. If you go the route with wild yeast, there is tons of waiting. Waiting for the yeast to get in. Waiting for the yeast to eat. Waiting for the yeast to multiply. Waiting, it takes days. And some of those sourdough starters, some of those levains have been around for years, for decades, passed from generation to generation, still developing, still getting those flavors, still becoming fuller, still becoming more real in themselves. Bread takes time. And more than that, it takes the right time. You can't just put it together and leave it. You have to be ready to respond. A half an hour to autolyze. 6 hours to rise. Another hour or so to proof. Waiting and waiting until the moment is right to take the next step. Waiting and waiting until everything is perfect to take the next step. The reign of God is no different. There is waiting. There is work to do while we are waiting, but there is waiting until the moment is right. And then when the moment is right, it is time to act. It is time to spring. It is time to do the thing. It is time to make God's reign of love bigger. And I know we have been waiting a little bit. I know we have been waiting a little bit because there has been so much to occupy our time. There has been so much to do, but waiting time is over. I can look at the world and see that it is time for the church to act. I can look at the world and see that it is a time for this place that talks about values, this place that says, for God's sake, love. The world would be better if there were more love in it. It is time to act. In every moment of every day. To go out and love, to see how we can love, to see how we can love little and to see how we can love big. And so I'm asking, I am imploring, I am begging us, and myself as well, to be yeast, to fill this community and this world with love, however we can, whenever we can, and to think big about love. Because if we think big about love, proper love, real love, the same love that God has for the world, the same love that Christ has for us, if we think big about love, if we do big about love, we might just grow God's reign of love until the oven doors burst open and the whole world is full of love.